Hello, and welcome everyone. I hope you're all doing well on this Thursday afternoon, morning, whatever time it is in your neck of the woods. My name's Shannon O'Loughlin. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and the CEO and attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs. Thank you for joining us. This is our final panel, our final keynote speaker for our conference. Beautiful Miss Sonya Atalay, who will be giving us some really good information about the work she's been doing regarding repatriation. And I want you to please stay after Sonya's keynote, because then Elder Cecil Pavlat from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe is going to be closing the conference out. So I hope you will stay on and join us for that short closing ceremony. I want to let you know I'm a little bit frazzled and my notes are here, so I'm not going to be able to give Sonya justice in her introduction, but I will tell you that I know Sonya from our time together on the NAGPRA Review Committee. And what I learned from Sonya, which has been so valuable, and I often think of her when I'm in situations where museums or auction houses or whoever is acting badly, because the first thing that I want to do is just is attack, is to get the bow and arrow, to get the gun, whatever I have, and knock the problem down. What I learned from Sonya in our time together on the NAGPRA Review Committee was how that kind of anger and advocacy can be turned into patience and care and forgiveness to drive home that information in a much more peaceful way. And I'm still learning how to best practice that advocacy. But I definitely owe it to Sonya and my work with her and her quiet and strong and patient perseverance in these issues and with adversaries that are not quite well thought. So without further ado, I want to invite Sonya to the forefront and remind all of you that please use the chat. Let us know how you're doing tonight, and the Q&A if you have questions, or raise your hand and I'll be back after the keynote and we'll respond to questions then. Thanks, Sonya. It's all yours.
Okay, great. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see. Looks like that should do it. Can you see that? Okay, great. Just give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. Wena bojo, bashking nungo kwe, Indigenous Anishinaabe-Ojibwe kwe nindao, wabajeshi ndodam, midday kwe nindao. I've shared with you my spirit name, Bashking Nungokwe, my tribal affiliation, I'm Anishinaabe-Ojibwe, and my clan, I'm Wabajeshi, the Pine Marten clan. And I also shared my status as a first-degree Midewan of the Three Fires Midewan Lodge, where the Midewan people are the carriers of traditional knowledge and teachings, and it's thought of traditionally as a medicine lodge. I begin by respectfully acknowledging the lands and waterways of Nonotuck, now known as Amherst, where I live and work. These lands and waters are living relations and the homelands of the Pecumtuck peoples. I recognize and greet with gratitude the ancestors and caretakers of these lands, past, present, and future, as well as their relatives to the east, south, west, and north. Miigwech, sincere thanks for the warm welcome, and thank you to AAIA for inviting me, and to everyone who assisted in organizing the conference. And thank you all for taking the time to be here on this last day as we close out what's been a wonderful conference. So I'll start with an overview of what I'll be discussing today. If you'd like any references, I'm going to be referencing different Indigenous scholars and things. This talk is based on a book that I'm currently finishing up that's called Braiding Knowledge, How Indigenous Knowledge is Challenging and Changing Universities. It's not out yet, but it should be out late next year. And also some of the points you can find in an article that Jane Anderson and I wrote titled Repatriation as Pedagogy. And that's going to be published later this year in Current Anthropology. So all of these references should be there. You can also just shoot me an email. I'm happy to share those if you're interested. So I begin by centering my work in what Joanne Archibald refers to as Indigenous story work. Throughout my talk, I draw on research from Indigenous scholars such as Robin Kimmerer, Kahante Horn-Miller, Linda Tahiwai-Smith, and Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, as well as Donna Haraway's notions of world building. I'll then turn to 3 examples of repatriation and reclaiming, each of which teach us lessons about how Native science and Indigenous knowledge systems are challenging and changing museums, universities, and government agencies. In these and other projects of repatriation and reclaiming, I've identified recurring themes that emerge regularly. I'll talk about 2 of those today. First is repatriation and reclaiming as healing. And second is repatriation and reclaiming as a teacher. Repatriation has taught us how to braid Indigenous knowledge into museums, universities, and government agencies. I'll close by considering the new, regenerative, healthy future worlds that we are nurturing based on the lessons we learn from repatriation. I agree with Arturo Escobar in his 2017 work when he says, we are, quote, at a time when designers are rediscovering people's ability to shape their worlds through relational and collaborative tools and solutions, end quote. Drawing on what Donna Haraway refers to as world building, I'll reflect on what repatriation teaches us. Repatriation gifts us with heart-centered practices that center relationality and emphasize interconnectivity, center knowledge that's written on the land, and our Indigenous pedagogies, our ways of teaching and learning. All of these contribute to healthy Indigenous futures, and they are the seeds necessary to heal our world in crisis. I situate the work I'm sharing today in a framework that Joanne Archibald, professor and former dean for Indigenous education at the University of British Columbia, refers to as Indigenous story work. Archibald defines this as making meaning with and through stories, noting that Indigenous stories and storytelling are to be taken seriously. That's a quote from her. Notably for the work I'll present today, Archibald makes the connection of story work to healing, health, and well-being. Her 2008 and 2019 books demonstrate how Indigenous peoples, quote, use stories to celebrate, to create whole, healthy human beings. So I thought it appropriate to begin with a story. Well, there's 2 stories, actually, the Haudenosaunee Sky Woman story and the Anishinaabe Earth Diver story. It's a creation story. Robin Kimmerer shares a beautiful version of the Sky Woman story in her 2015 book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Archibald and Kimmerer's work inspired me to think deeply about the relevance of stories as teachings to inform our contemporary world today, for addressing issues facing Native peoples, and also for rethinking research methods, approaches to university teaching and learning, even the structures of our institutions. This story was brought to life before my eyes when in October 2015, I was fortunate to witness Kahante Horn-Miller, a Kahnawake Mohawk scholar, share a performative interpretation of the Sky Woman story as adapted from her recent research. In both her beautiful performance and her published work, Hornmiller demonstrates the relevance of the Sky Woman story for our contemporary world. Hornmiller's performance, aptly titled, "We Are Here and She Is in Us, Revisiting the Sky Woman Story," reveals the hardships and healing that are necessary for moving Sky Woman's world forward. I argue that the teachings in this and other Indigenous stories are relevant today, particularly as we face environmental devastation and a world in crisis. I share with you an abbreviated version of the story. Sky Woman lives among the Sky people. She is pregnant and one day sees a giant hole in her world that was created by an uprooted tree. She jumps into the hole and falls for a very long time. The animals in the world below, which is our world here on Earth, see her falling. They talk amongst themselves, trying to decide what to do, how they can help her. As Sky Woman falls, she grasps onto trees and plants, grabbing handfuls of seeds, including corn, beans, and squash, that will come to nourish the people of Turtle Island, and sacred plants of tobacco and strawberries, both powerful medicines. Geese decide to help Sky Woman. A flock of them fly over to catch her and help break her fall. Sky Woman rests on their backs as they fly together. Meanwhile, the animals below are trying to decide on a place where Sky Woman can come to rest. This next part of the story is told by Anishinaabe peoples as well. It's a time when melting waters have created a great flood, causing waters to cover much of the land. Animals look for solid ground among the floodwaters. Hoping to create space for a new world that can sustain life, the animals take turns diving down to find soil. Many animals lose their lives without success. Eventually, muskrat volunteers to dive under the waters in search of earth, an idea that some animals think is ill-conceived because muskrat is small and not the best of swimmers. The animals doubt muskrat's ability to succeed where so many have failed. Muskrat dives down, and after a very long time, after many of the animals had lost hope, she emerges. Her lifeless body floats to the surface, holding a tiny paw full of soil. The animals place the earth on the back of a turtle who volunteers to hold it. Sky Woman gently dances on that soil, and as she dances, it expands and circles outward to become Turtle Island, the name many Native peoples use to refer to North America. As Hornmiller and Kimmerer discuss, this story and others are not just beautiful folk tales. I agree with Hornmiller when she writes, and she embodies in her performance, that Sky Woman is in us. And she's still gifting us with lessons today. Kimmerer in 2013 writes, quote, "In the public arena, I've heard the Sky Woman story told as a bauble of colorful folklore. But even when it is misunderstood, there is power in the telling." Kimmerer describes sharing this story with her students, and she asks, can we all understand the Sky Woman story not as an artifact from the past, but as instructions for the future? The repatriation and reclaiming work I'll share today grew from Kimmerer's question and from Indigenous scholars and community members who, while considering climate change and, as Anna Singh says, life in post-capitalist ruins, they point to the need for transforming and preparing practices for new worlds. Donna Haraway notes, the idea that disaster will come is not new to Indigenous peoples. Genocidal disaster has already come decades and centuries ago and has not stopped. And the people have not ceased ongoing worlding either. For Indigenous peoples, preparing for a very different future world often involves looking to the past. Reclaiming is essential, not in order to recreate a past world, but because repatriation and reclaiming can contribute to healing from historical trauma and provides us with lessons for creating healthy Indigenous futures and ways of healing and bringing us into right relations with our lands, water, and animal relations. The ancestors and the knowledge we repatriate and reclaim gift us with seeds for the future. And the processes that are developed through repatriation provide us with a model for transforming institutions, what Escobar refers to as recreating relational and cooperative models of living with humans and nature. I've found through numerous repatriation projects with Native nations that the lessons we learn from repatriation and the work of reclaiming both tangible and intangible heritage are acts of worlding, bringing seeds forward for contributing to well-being and creating new and vibrant worlds needed for survival in a very different future. These practices have direct positive impact in Indigenous communities, and practices we learn in repatriation work also serve as teachers for transforming the world we live in today. What we learn from repatriation can have much broader relevance. What we learn from repatriation challenges and can change the extractive research practices and the problematic policies we see nationally and globally, many of which we've heard talked about over the past weeks in this conference. I've seen that lessons from the lessons from the incredible and difficult work that you all do in repatriation and reclaiming can provide a model for regenerative futures. A model that teaches universities, museums, state, federal agencies, and other institutions how to engage in heart-centered work that places relationality and interconnectivity at the center. These are practices that value, strengthen, and build relationships, that recognize interconnectivity between the past, present, and future, that connect us with each other and with our more than human relations, our plant, animal, water, and sky relatives. Repatriation teaches us knowledge that is needed for building and nourishing sustainable futures, a point I'll come back to at the end of my talk. We can look at some of the problematic practices that still surround us, extractive practices that co-opt native knowledges, bodies, homelands, and belongings. These all draw on one knowledge system, the Western knowledge system, that views the world through a singular, rational, linear, extractive lens. When Native nations take the lead, our repatriation work together teaches us how to build relationships and research partnerships that value multiple knowledge systems and are restorative and regenerative. From repatriating our ancestors to reclaiming sacred sites, Indigenous language, songs, traditional teachings, and methods of story work, repatriation and reclaiming urge us to build our capacity for thinking through a different knowledge system, through Native knowledge systems. And repatriation guides us in braiding knowledge, bringing Indigenous and Western knowledge together. It provides us examples of what Mi'kmaq teachings call two-eyed seeing. For the repatriation work I've done with Native nations, an Indigenous research model is fundamental. For those not familiar, here's a quick overview illustrated by a conceptual model from Abenaki scholar Lori Lambert. My colleagues and I produced a book called Archaeologies of the Heart that focuses on heart-centered research practices. And if you're interested, I'm happy to send you a free PDF of that. It's kind of a pricey book, but I'm happy to send that to you. So just let me know. The book considers heart-centered research in archaeology, but the practices are applicable to any field. I raise this Indigenous paradigm here because in my time engaging in repatriation work with Native nations and on the NAGPRA Review Committee, I found that heart-centered practices such as these are what Native nations often bring to the work. The heart-centered practices that I write about in my chapter in Archaeologies of the Heart are based on Indigenous Anishinaabe knowledge, particularly the lessons of the strawberries, or in Ojibwe, odamen, which translates in English to heartberries. My chapter in the book is called An Archaeology Led by Strawberries, And much of the repatriation and reclaiming work I've experienced involves these essential aspects that you see here on the screen. Most fundamental, the work is community-based. Community questions, concerns, methods, and knowledge systems are at the center of the repatriation and reclaiming process. Communities are co-researchers working in partnership with museums and scholars. Following Joanne Archibald, Indigenous R's, the letter R, are guiding principles. Relationality and relationships are at the center. Reciprocity, recognition of diverse knowledge systems, respect, relevance, and responsibility are also fundamental. And following what Tuck and Yang, as well as Haudenosaunee anthropologist Audra Simpson's work tell us, refusal also has an important role, thinking about what cannot and should not be seen, discussed, or shared. We respect what communities don't want to share and how to protect what they do share, setting limits and making visible the invisibilized limits. Capacity building is also a priority, but often we talk about capacity building within Native communities, but I think it's also essential that we recognize that capacity building is needed on the museum, university, and state and federal agency sides as well. Scholars, students, administrators, and those in state and federal agencies must grow their capacity to understand and incorporate Indigenous protocols and knowledge systems, engage in long-term reciprocal relationship building and co-learning. Of course, as those of you who do this work on a daily basis know very well, relational capacity building and true power sharing can pose complex challenges for universities, museums, and government agencies. Repatriation teaches us how vital these skills and practices are, not just for repatriation work, but well beyond. These are essential survival skills necessary for our world in crisis. Knowledge mobilization is another. Repatriation and reclaiming often requires careful, detailed research. But return of ancestors and bringing Indigenous knowledge back into our communities often connects to another forward, future-facing goal. Moving or mobilizing the stories of our repatriation work and sharing reclaimed knowledge in culturally appropriate ways, such as through contemporary methods of story work, like I'm going to talk about some today, comics, animations, virtual reality, and story baskets, for example. That can be important for many Native communities. I'll share several examples of story work and knowledge mobilization and a few examples of how Native communities and museums, universities, and government agencies can benefit from knowledge mobilization that's related to repatriation and reclaiming. So I'll just briefly share 3 examples of repatriation and reclaiming. Each involves braiding knowledge, bringing together strands of Indigenous teaching and learning, Native science and knowledge systems, and story work. What I found through this work is that 2 themes recur. First is that reclaiming involves a complex process of healing. And second, that reclaiming is instructive for building regenerative rather than extractive futures. Though repatriation and reclaiming require looking to the past and righting egregious wrongs, in my experience, the intention of the work is also future-focused on what my elders and some of our Anishinaabe teachings describe as sending knowledge into the future. This work is part of an enduring responsibility for our ancestors, but also to future generations. A responsibility that is of increasing concern with the changing climate and as we develop new ways of solving complex global problems. The first example I'll share is about reclaiming ancestors and transforming institutions. It's a partnership with Anishinaabe Native Nations in Michigan in an effort for the tribes to reclaim ancestral remains from the University of Michigan. This work began as NAGPRA affiliation research. It involved archaeological research and working with elders, Medewan spiritual leaders, and knowledge carriers to record oral histories, kinship concepts, and understandings of sacred objects in order to document the Anishinaabe perspective for a NAGPRA claim of over 1,000 ancestors from the University of Michigan. The Native nations I partnered with decided to share this repatriation story and passed on their work of successfully transforming the University of Michigan using storytelling in the accessible format of a graphic novel. We worked with Shannon Martin, William Johnson, George and Sydney Martin, and the dedicated Z team at the Wellbeing Center to make this work possible. Coming from storytelling traditions, the power of sharing, imparting lessons, and helping others learn through stories is important for many Native and Indigenous peoples. With the aim of telling stories of contemporary experiences of reclaiming and sharing these experiences, we developed a NAGPRA comic series to tell real-life stories of repatriation in an accessible format of visual storytelling. This was a collaborative process between myself, John Swager, who is the illustrator, and Jen Shannon, a scholar in museum studies, in partnership with the Wellbeing Center of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. This first comic explains NAGPRA law, with particular emphasis on the 10.11 or the culturally unidentifiable rule. It details the concept of cultural affiliation from an Anishinaabe perspective and from the legal perspective. And it details the collaborative research Michigan tribal nations engaged in to claim ancestors from the University of Michigan and Harvard University. We released the comic in fall 2017 at Indigenous Comic-Con. If you haven't heard of or gone to Indigenous Comic-Con, it's so awesome. It's amazing. It's usually held at Isleta Pueblo. It's fantastic. And I learned so much from meeting so many amazing Native artists and comics writers. In the interest of time, I'm going to provide a very brief overview here of the story told in this graphic novel. Shannon Martin and I have presented on our NAGPRA work together in previous conferences as well. So I think you could probably watch some of those in the archives. As the graphic novel documents, the University of Michigan went from having one of the worst reputations in terms of repatriation and their relationships with Native nations to being a national leader. This process happened as a result of Native activism that led the university to completely rethink its approach to NAGPRA. This led the university not only to improve relationships with tribes in Michigan, but to new collaborative projects and cutting-edge research partnerships, such as a co-curated exhibit of Anishinaabe baskets and a community garden that is reviving ancient seeds. Shannon Martin, David Michener of the University of Michigan's Matai Botanical Gardens, and I spoke about this work, Rematriating Seeds, in our AAIA Repatriation Conference session last year. And it's also the focus of NAGPRA Comic issue number 3. We have a series of these now, which we are currently working on and we anticipate will be released next year. As those of you who have engaged in repatriation work you know so well, NAGPRA law is process-oriented, providing specific detailed regulations that must be followed, as well as a timeline for following them. NAGPRA law requires that Native people provide evidence to demonstrate affiliation to ancestors' sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. And it also allows space for Native peoples to share their understanding of connection, relationship, and affiliation. This provides a space to share our Native knowledge system and our worldview. As this page demonstrates, the concept of interconnectivity is a central worldview that informs Anishinaabe understandings of cultural affiliation within NAGPRA. The activism and leadership of Michigan's tribal nations, as depicted in this graphic novel, led the university to recognize and value Anishinaabe ways of knowing and knowledge systems. Through the reclaiming process, these Native nations guided the university in building its capacity for recognizing and understanding another knowledge system. And it helped build the university's capacity for working in partnership with Native nations. The institution came to respect several core Anishinaabe tribal values, what you might have I've referred to before and others as Indigenous R's, such as relationality, respect, reciprocity, and relevance. These R's were braided into the university's policies. Not only does the comic document the community's acts of reclaiming, but their understanding of reclaiming as healing is a central theme. In conducting repatriation research in my role on the National NAGPRA Review Committee, and also in the work I've done developing repatriation policies and assisting with work in repatriation at my home institution here at UMass Amherst, I found that rather than being framed as what Eve Tuck refers to as damage-centered research, the sharing of repatriation experiences and stories of reclaiming are told as truth-telling. So not talked about in a way that this is damage that's happened to Native communities, but sharing these stories of repatriation really is truth-telling. And they're often described as healing and contributing to an individual and community well-being. And notably, it's not only the acts of reclaiming themselves, but also people talk about sharing stories of reclaiming as also being healing, that act of sharing stories can help heal and that it can contribute to well-being. So to better understand this, I've drawn on the work of Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and Gros Ventre scholar Joe Gahn, trying to better understand this connection between reclaiming and healing through the lens of historical trauma and unresolved historical grief. In developing this repatriation comic, it was important that the story end with a discussion of healing. This is also the case with nearly every repatriation that I've assisted with. The ceremony ends with a reminder about the healing it brings. Shannon Martin, Zebwing's former director, regularly speaks about healing and well-being that comes from the research and other work involved in reclaiming. Martin says, and you can see it also here quoted on the bottom of this page, quote, "And with every repatriation, with every recommitment to the earth, great healing and reconciliation happens, not only with our community, but with all those institutions and people that may have handled our ancestors through study or research. There is joy that they have come home, that their work is complete." We also recorded an animation to demonstrate that the story of repatriation is ongoing. It's not static. It's not complete or finished. There is work left to do and stories yet to be told. This comic also documents a second story of repatriation from Harvard University. Harvard University returned ancestral remains, but even though there was ample geographic evidence to culturally affiliate, Harvard categorized these ancestors as, quote, culturally unidentifiable, and refused to return the associated funerary objects with the ancestors. This page explains from an Anishinaabe perspective why those belongings need to be with the ancestors as they make their journey, describing how the belongings are traveling items that need to do work along the journey with each ancestor. It was important to help people understand this cultural knowledge and the importance of having these belongings together with each individual. Sharing this difficult experience through a comic helped to bring awareness to this problematic policy that Harvard had. As many of you know, recently, it was just earlier this year, just weeks ago in 2021, Harvard has now changed that policy and will allow traveling items, what the law refers to as associated funerary objects, to be returned along with ancestral remains under the 10.11 process. In the interest of time, I won't play or show the animation, but I can do so later if you want to see it. As you see from this and the next two examples, stories are essential, Indigenous story work. Sharing knowledge through stories is something our ancestors have done for millennia. The next example demonstrates how Anishinaabe peoples in the past used visual images to carry teachings and mobilize knowledge. Making stories of repatriation and reclaiming accessible for Native community members, and especially for Native youth, has been an important way of sharing experiences and lessons with others. It's also important to share with students and museum professionals these stories so that they hear and can learn from these experiences. Also, diverse communities who are not involved in NAGPRA can also learn from these stories. This includes Indigenous communities globally who are working to repatriate their ancestors, as well as Black and other communities of color whose ancestors and relatives we often see on museum shelves when we are working for the return of our ancestors. We share our stories to help bring their ancestors home too. Indigenous pedagogy, our ways of teaching and learning, are increasingly also being reclaimed. Stories are taken seriously and understood as a powerful means to communicate, to remember, and to share valuable scientific information. This is Indigenous science, working with stories and sharing information, remembering information, recording information this way through stories. That's Indigenous science. And we repatriate ancestors and belongings. We also, as we do that, we also reclaim these methods of Indigenous science, including our Native ways of teaching and learning and of sharing knowledge for the benefit of others. This and other examples of story work include sharing stories through comics, animation, virtual reality applications, story baskets, and story maps. We can use the methods of stories to share our experiences of repatriating. Perhaps other communities or museums will learn from those stories and that we share, and they share their stories as well. We all learn from each other. The repatriation lessons from this first example about braiding knowledge into the policies at the University of Michigan and about taking seriously the value of Native stories and story work are teachers that can guide our work of reclaiming, such as reclaiming and protecting sacred sites. That's one way that we learn from repatriation of ancestors. That's the case in the second example that I'll share, called Ejibikadek Asin, Reclaiming and Protecting Knowledge Written on the Land. This example also illustrates that reclaiming contributes to healing, and it is a powerful example of how reclaiming is a teacher that helps instruct us in building a future, healthy, and sustainable world. It shows us how Native knowledge systems and stories can be braided into the policies and practices of government agencies. This work involved protection and care of a sacred site. It shows how a Native concept of protection and care can differ from Western concepts. And in fact, they often do. We aren't meaning the same things when we talk about protection and care. These are different ways of thinking about those words and the practices associated with them. The work was carried out that I'm going to talk about with Shannon Martin, William Johnson, and the Z team at the Zebwing Center of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe, and it focuses on a sacred site in Cass, Michigan. For archaeologists, this place is called Sanilac Petroglyphs. It's often referred to as a rock art site. But for Anishinaabe people, this place is called Ejibikadek Asin, the place where knowledge is written on stone, because of the traditional knowledge it carries in multiple petroglyphs. It is in Anishinaabe traditional homelands and is a sacred place that carries important teachings. Healing, water, and fasting ceremonies used to be held here. For decades, the site was owned and run by the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, who put up the structure you can see there in the photo on the left, that wooden structure, which covers the large rock outcropping that has over 100 petroglyphs, 100 teachings, and it's completely covered. The DNR also put a locked fence around the site, which was only open a small number of hours for tourism. Spiritual leaders, elders, and community members didn't have access and had to ask permission, actually, to visit and enter through the locked gate. When the state ran out of funds and had to close the site completely, that's when they asked for assistance from nearby Native nations. These were gaming tribes presumed to have funds that might help the struggling state archaeology office. In partnership with elders, spiritual leaders, knowledge carriers, and a team of community members, we worked with the state archaeologist to find ways to appropriately care for this site. Our goal was to develop a site management plan that included joint management with the state, as well as a community survey that would direct future appropriate use of this place. We developed the research design for this project and applied for grant funds. We conducted interviews and did participatory planning or focus groups with Midewiwin elders and knowledge carriers. The need to push back and challenge Western approaches to knowledge production, to what it means to protect and care for this sacred place, became a central focus of our work. Our work pushed back against the state's notion of what ethical protection and care look like. Over the course of several years, we developed appropriate research ethics guidelines and also guidance for protection of the images of the teachings at Ojibwe Asin. We also worked together to think of how now in our time, we care for these and other sacred places, not as art or rock art or archaeology sites, but as they were meant to be, as teachers. They're sacred beings who are alive and animate. So while a state and a Western archaeological science notion of care is to cover and restrict access, an Anishinaabe notion of care is to touch and be in contact and to give water to this ancestor. We learned from this work from spiritual leaders that in our language, this place, the stone on which these teachings are carved, is animate. She is a grandmother, an animate being that requires water. This grandmother needed to be spoken to in Anishinaabe-Ojibwe and cared for with water ceremonies. So in these, water from the adjacent river, and we're told that that river is always speaking the teachings, that the water that flows right next to this place, that river is always speaking the teachings that are etched on the stone as it flows. So the water's poured over the stone. But because of the covering and the restrictions on ceremonies, Ojibwe Asin had not had water in decades. The state DNR office was concerned about harm to the petroglyphs and preservation of the object for future generations. This state's object-focused concept of preservation comes into direct contradiction with Anishinaabe concepts of preservation, which are focused on relationality and actions of care for a relative, not an object. Anishinaabe goals were also about preserving knowledge for the future. In fact, that is particularly the case for this place, which has a key teaching about sharing knowledge and ensuring it is passed on for future generations. Anishinaabe teachings instruct that knowledge of this place should be shared. The instruction is literally written on the land itself in this image that is carved in the stone. And I just want to note that the image has been slightly altered according to cultural protocols, so that required it shouldn't be exactly reproduced out of context. So it's been slightly altered. In this view, Anishinaabe view, preservation is through use, something the state archaeologist was concerned would damage the site. Archaeologists call this, the image you see, the archer, but Anishinaabe refer to this as Abamadakwit. Rather than seeing an archer who is hunting, Abamadakwit is the one who is sending knowledge into the future. Anishinaabe ancestors anticipated that troubled times were ahead, and they sent knowledge forward in the most reliable way they knew. And that was visual images accompanied by oral teachings. We wanted to explore how to best share knowledge about Ojibwe Asin, while also protecting the images and the teachings from commodification and exploitation. We also considered how to reclaim this sacred site as a place of healing for fasting and water ceremonies, rather than simply a tourist attraction owned by the state where archaeological interpretations of hunting were shared on signage. So this place was covered and gated with the best of intentions to care for her in a way that makes sense within Western knowledge systems. All of this reflects a particular relationship with and understanding of objects and of knowledge. Those are all built around Western views that trace back to the Enlightenment, in which things were categorized and divided in particular ways. So the harm and the conflict comes when those ways of knowing are seen as the way of knowing. Our research helped to demonstrate that intent does not equal impact. And we know this, we know and see this so much in our work with repatriation. The intent, whatever someone's intent was, is not the same of what the impact is. Despite the state's good intentions, the impact was still harmful and damaging to Anishinaabe ways of protection and care that are based on ways of knowing related to animacy of place and relationality. We documented these Anishinaabe notions of care and work with the state to adopt or make room for these in their care practices and through the posted signage. This work was long-term and took many years. It was slow, complex, and challenging work carried out by the folks out at Wellbeing. When we have a cultural ethic of care that requires sharing the knowledge of this place and making it accessible, we then think about how can that be done while also protecting the place and the teachings in culturally appropriate ways. In fact, we found that the image had already been inappropriately used. Here you see the image was used by the Midwest Archaeological Congress for their 2012 conference. We didn't want it further commodified or displayed on coffee mugs or t-shirts, those sorts of things. When I Googled it to do the research, it was shocking how this image showed up in many inappropriate ways already. We found that Anishinaabe people also needed to be reminded that this is not a hunting story. Rather, the image depicts a shkabewis, a spiritual being who assists and teaches, and brings well-being to Anishinaabe people through sharing knowledge. One tribal member was opening a hunting store, for example, and wanted to use this as a logo. And community members then engaged in relearning the language of animacy, remembering to care for this knowledge as a relative, not an object, an artifact, or art. Our research and that of Wellbeing in developing long-term relationships resulted in a change in the state's policies and protocols. With many hours of hard work and relationship building by the Wellbeing team, the Michigan DNR now allow regular access to the site and developed a plan of joint ownership and culturally appropriate care. So this is a poster that features Ejibigade-Kasin for Michigan Archaeology Week. You can see that in now the Anishinaabe name for the site is used, and the explanation of this place and its importance for healing ceremonies is also featured. Here are the new signage and flyers that are now printed and in place at Ejibigade-Kasin. The language and interpretation is all based on Anishinaabe knowledge frameworks. And also those are braided with scientific methods that were used to record and protect the images, such as LiDAR. Those are also explained. They're braided together. After many years of work by Wellbeing and tribal leaders, on December 2nd, 2019, the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe signed an MOU that established the tribe's co-management with the state's Department of Natural Resources. This means Anishinaabe people are now able to resume fasting and water ceremonies at the site. They have easy access to the plant medicines that grow there and reconnect with Ejibigade-Kasin in ways that facilitate healing. So the outcome obviously matters here, but the process is equally instructive. Again, as in the repatriation project I shared earlier, reclaiming is not simply focused on protecting the past. But just as Abama and the teachings on this sacred place instruct, the work is forward-facing in an effort to send knowledge into the future. I see an important aspect of that reclaiming work as being able to lead and teach institutions in developing new ways of thinking, new ways of researching, new ways of carrying out their work. Building government agency capacity for understanding Indigenous knowledge systems, and planting these seeds of Indigenous knowledge so together we can nurture and sustain new research worlds. The examples I've shared thus far are two that I've been involved with, and so I know them well. And there are so many more examples, though, that I've learned from listening to the work all of you are doing. I see in so much of your work how repatriation is teaching us all so much. And your work has inspired me, so thank you, Miigwech, for all of your work. This third example, holding land-based Native science youth camps and university teaching with Indigenous pedagogy, demonstrates some of the ways I've applied the lessons that I've learned from repatriation and reclaiming. For the youth camps, I work with Native community partners to develop a camp around whatever topic has community relevance. Tribal youth walk the land with elders and knowledge carriers, placing emphasis on intergenerational learning and reclaiming traditional ecological knowledge, Native language, and cultural teachings. We research archaeological places, and we may map sacred places or identify and learn plant medicines or learn traditional place names and the stories that are associated with those places. Any number of things that we collaboratively design for the camp. The camps are fully funded through my Reclaiming Indigenous Cultural Heritage, or RICH lab at UMass. So they're free and they last 1 week. And drawing on my work in repatriation and reclaiming, such as what I shared in the previous two examples, I developed these camps to work with Native youth and with UMass, the undergrad and grad students that I teach here at UMass, to engage in intergenerational projects of reclaiming so that we can put into practice methods of braiding knowledge, of braiding Western and Native science. Experiencing the power of our Native stories, the relevance of these stories today as they continue to gift us with important lessons. I use Indigenous pedagogy, so that's just our Native methods of teaching and learning. I consider how these learning experiences can contribute to well-being and focus on Native concepts of health and well-being, which, different than Western concepts of health, is just not simply focused on physical health. Or on simply developing the mind, right? Just thinking and everything that's up here, right? But rather Native concepts of health and well-being that include mind, body, spirit, and emotion, and that those are all in balance. So that's the kind of thinking that goes into developing the camps and also the teaching that I do at UMass. The camps and much of my university teaching focus on land-based knowledge, braiding together the physical activity of walking and paddling with learning to read the land, and other hands-on learning, along with spiritual and emotional learning. So elders may share traditional teachings and stories, and we often explore ways of connecting traditional stories with plant knowledge, geology, star knowledge, and archaeology. Students braid together these strands of research and share what they've learned through story work. So in the camps, youth tell stories of their homelands by crafting what I call story maps. Students in my UMass classes make story maps also. And these aren't your typical kind of two-dimensional flat maps that are drawn on paper or in a computer, what you might immediately think of when I say maps. We make maps from any number of materials, from burning maps on leather and carving images onto gourds or creating a board game filled with teachings that other kids can play. I refer to all of these as maps. One camp participant, for example, explored ethnobotany for women's medicines and plant names. And we worked with her to research the plant medicines a woman would use during each month of her pregnancy. She learned from an elder to identify those plants growing in their homelands, and then worked with a language speaker to learn the names of each plant. She then told the story of what she'd learned by creating a story map, carving the plants and their traditional names onto this gourd. You can see it's the bottom right image. She's divided the gourd into appropriate times for using each of those medicines. In another camp, a participant researched the river system and fish names, then created a map to share what he learned, and that's in the upper left. While learning and reclaiming cultural knowledge, youth share what they learned through stories, and they record those stories through art, creating a mnemonic device to help them remember and share their research. So I see this as a contemporary form of Ibamadakwit, what we just talked about in the second example, the previous example, sending knowledge into the future through stories and through combining that with art and visual images. I use similar Indigenous methods of teaching and learning in the grad and undergrad courses I teach at UMass. So in the bottom center, you can see one student created a light box to tell a visual story of her research that youth in the camps that I host, they really love that one. She put a little light, embedded a light underneath, and has this long scroll that tells the story, and you get to scroll through it. So that was just another example that one of the students created. Applying the lessons of repatriation and using story work and Indigenous pedagogy are all ways that I'm working to indigenize and decolonize the university curriculum. In youth camps and in my university courses, I teach students traditional basket making techniques, for example, but adapt the skill to use recycled materials like discarded yogurt containers and upcycled yarn. You can see one in the upper right. They use this technique, so they're learning a basket making technique with these new materials. They use these techniques to create story baskets, which tell the stories of what they've learned in my class at UMass or in their week-long camp experience. And this one in the upper right, the story basket you see, it's a participant from one of the youth camps, and he titled it My Loves, in which he chose to tell the story of what he'd learned about his homelands and all the things he loves about them and you can follow the story from the wetlands to the river, the waterways, and the sunrises. And he told this beautifully, the story, and this is the mnemonic device to help him remember that story and to share the appropriate parts that he wants to share, and also to think about refusal, the parts that maybe only you know, or your certain parts of your community, or maybe clan members know, but others from outside the clan or outside the tribe don't know those pieces. It's just reminding me a lot of what I learned from that work with Ibamadakwit and Ejibikadek Asin, how our ancestors learned from knowledge written on the land and shared those stories through art. In the camps and in my UMass classes, students share their research via images and videos of the story baskets and the story maps they created. They work collaboratively with elders, with each other, and with UMass students to incorporate those stories into ThingLink. So ThingLink, you can find it free online, ThingLink, it's all one word. It's a virtual reality storytelling application. It's so easy to use, and it's viewable through an inexpensive, just those Google Cardboards. So youth really love it. Students in my class love working with it. And it's very accessible and easy to use. You could take a 360 camera, take a 360 image, so you can use it to take pictures of land and places. And then you can embed images and video, and the youth can do all of this really easily. So comics, virtual reality, animation, and games, creating games, are just a few of the accessible methods I found for sharing research. I utilize these arts-based methods for a contemporary Indigenous science as a way to help students engage in reclaiming knowledge and practices. They're braiding Western and Indigenous science and sharing their research through stories. The youth camps and my UMass courses, they all teach heart-centered practices of research that center relationality and interconnectivity. Holism is central for this Indigenous science. So all these same themes keep coming up that I've learned from the repatriation work. I hold regular talking circles in the camps and in my courses about what it means to repatriate, to reclaim, to indigenize, and to decolonize. These are spaces where elders share stories and youth can ask questions and share their experiences and challenges. The format of the camp creates space for multi-directional, hands-on, land-based learning and using art to share research. This involves intergenerational learning, So here in the bottom right, you can see one of the participants teaching an elder, not just the elders teaching youth, but the youth teaching an elder to use the Google Cardboard in order to view this VR that he created in ThingLink. And it's great because it has something called gaze control, ThingLink, which means if there's a video that you've embedded, all she would have to do is just look at the video, and the ThingLink picks up what your eyes are looking at, and it starts playing the video and will play the music. So it's really an immersive experience that youth can really easily do, and it brings their work to life. Inspired by the work of repatriating ancestors and learning lessons from reclaiming sacred places and the knowledge they carry, these are methods of reclaiming our native science and Indigenous methods of teaching and learning. I call it Indigenous STEM, since it integrates TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, and Indigenous science knowledge, plant medicines, geological knowledge, archaeology, mapping and map skills, with history, native language, and cultural and spiritual knowledge. And all of these are able to be combined. Our research in the youth camps and with my UMass students is community-based, carried out in partnership using heart-centered research methods, shared via Indigenous story work, braiding the knowledge together using visuals and art as a way of sending knowledge into the future. As I begin to wrap up my talk, I'd like to point to two recurring themes in the examples I shared. The first is reclaiming as healing, inspired by the synergies between healing, repatriation, reclaiming, and these heart-centered Indigenous research processes, and the use of story work. I've explored Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and Joe Gaughan's research in an effort to understand historical trauma and unresolved grief. Through this, I'm trying to learn more about how repatriation and reclaiming Native cultural heritage contributes to emotional, spiritual healing, and thus improved well-being. Braveheart defines historical unresolved grief as, and this is her quote, "the profound, unsettled bereavement resulting from cumulative, devastating losses, compounded by the prohibition and interruption of Indigenous burial practices and ceremonies," end quote. Braveheart, a Lakota social worker and public health scholar, explicitly makes the connection between reclaiming and healing from historical trauma and unresolved historical grief. The connection Braveheart finds through a public health lens relies on health through a Native American perspective, as opposed to a Western kind of biomedical model that is primarily physical. Although now it does increasingly consider mental health as well, the Western model. An Anishinaabe perspective of health is described in our language, for example, as minobimatiziwin. It braids physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. It's just living a good life that encompasses all of those things, all in balance. This holistic view of health helps to explain and give context to what I found in my experiences, that repatriating human remains and other ancestors' belongings, and that reclaiming forms of traditional knowledge, protocols, all of these reclaiming work through heart-centered and collaborative research partnerships, that it's experienced and described by those who engage in this work as healing and as bringing a sense of well-being. I really felt that connection in reading Braveheart's work. It seems, I hear it all the time and felt it in my own work, and hear others talk about that. But Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart's work really helped give an understanding to what's happening. I do want to complicate this connection somewhat, though, because the connection of reclaiming and healing, we heard this in several times throughout this conference, and just in the last session, the incredible young women that we heard speaking talked about this as well, that that's not always linear and direct, right? That healing is not just a one-way kind of very easy, direct, linear thing that happens. The work involved in reclaiming can present barriers and real struggle. Abenaki elder Judy Dow, who participated in the land-based knowledge camps, describes this in her work on the Vermont Eugenics Survey, which was founded in 1925 by the University of Vermont zoology professor Henry Perkins. Scientific beliefs of that time purported that social traits were hereditary. So they produced this survey, which was aimed to identify, quote, undesirables, which Abenaki peoples were characterized as at that time. Eugenicists had a list of what they referred to as, and these are quotes, defective, delinquent, and dependent people. That included the poor, the orphaned, queer, epileptic, insane, and rapists, and that's just to name a few that were on their list. The eugenicists aimed to rid these groups from Vermont in order to, another quote, breed better Vermonters. Judy Dow's family was one of the primary targets of the Vermont Eugenics Survey. She traces over 600 of her extended family who were sterilized or institutionalized. In collaborating on these Indigenous science camps together, Judy and I worked on these, Judy describes this work as healing, particularly when she is able to discuss and educate others about eugenics injustices. Yet, she noted that it can also present new trauma, particularly when facing denial about the impacts of eugenics or refusal to acknowledge the role that state institutions continue to play in painful aspects of eugenics today. Museum or university denial of repatriation and having to prove affiliation of ancestors and battles for the return of traveling items or associated funerary objects, or concern for what to share during a consultation for fear of creating a new archive that researchers can potentially extract from. We also are remaining constantly vigilant for museums and universities who find loopholes and produce barriers to repatriation rather than actively working for our ancestors' return. All of these struggles that we've been talking about, that we share with each other, all of this can also reactivate or cause new trauma. Engaging in these types of battles and struggles in order to reclaim can have harmful effects. So care and approaching the work thoughtfully is essential. Experiences around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada illustrate the complexity of this connection between sharing stories, trauma, and healing. For many, sharing painful stories of residential school can be experienced as healing. We saw that in the TRC's work. While for others, it ignited new trauma. An example of how voicing trauma can be detrimental is illustrated here in the work of Diné scholar Lisa Bovin. In her recent book titled I Will See You Again, Bovin uses arts-based research, specifically visual arts, to, and this is a quote from her, to humanize clinical medicine through storytelling. Bovin is braiding Indigenous and Western knowledge to tell powerful stories of healing and well-being. In reference to her unnamed painting, which is shown here, Bovin says it is unnameable because, quote, words have power. To give words to something is to give it power. End quote. The painting tells the story of her father, providing what is called an independent assessment statement for the TRC. This was required to receive compensation for the years he spent attending residential school. Bovin shares that he was obliged to detail verbally the colonial indignities he had suffered. And she explains that this is painted as chaos, with the pages of notes swirling around because his wellness was severely affected by being forced to speak about his experiences. He'd had challenges on and off with walking, but after he made this statement, she says he did not walk again. So in Bovin's example, it's the forced telling of experience that was what was damaging. Again, refusal becomes central here. Choosing to tell one's stories and how those are shared makes all the difference. Reclaiming, healing, and Indigenous story work, to use Hustak and Meyer's phrasing, requires reading with our senses attuned to otherwise muted registers. As with Haraway's science art worldings, in the work I've shared today, Indigenous story work is essentially intertwined in the work of reclaiming, particularly as we look to the future. Story work allows us to imagine and then to create different futures. To borrow a phrase from Escobar, we can bring our reclaimed knowledge together through stories and visuals, hands-on methods, and this enhances this is what Escobar says, our future imaginary capacity. The second recurring theme, and the one I tried to emphasize here in my examples to you today, is that repatriation and reclaiming are teachers. These are our teachers. While NAGPRA provided a specific legal process, and as we know well, it is simultaneously flawed and incomplete, a perhaps unintended outcome of 30 years of NAGPRA practice is the way in which repatriation has been deeply instructive about research and collecting practices of the past. And that's provided insights for that imaginary capacity, that forward thinking about what must change and what is possible for future directions. The same is true for other practices of reclaiming. Through the daily and long-term practices of reclaiming, Native communities and the museums, scholars, government agencies they partnered with have, in certain instances, I think we've moved into a new phase. We can see examples of the process and practices of repatriation and use them as models for other collaborations. The ways of knowing and the knowledge system shared through repatriation and reclaiming can provide a means for teaching how to establish better, more robust, more ethical, and equitable future relationships. These three examples show how reclaiming is a teacher. We, as scholars, museum officials, government agency staff, and university administrators, are asked to be differently alert to hidden histories, to entangled bureaucracies, to impoverished records, and ethical care. Learning from repatriation, we can engage in braiding knowledge to transform how we work together to solve complex problems facing us globally. So while some may view repatriation and broader projects of reclaiming solely as critique of institutions or with the aim of righting past wrongs, and I definitely agree that these are critiques of institutions and they are very important for righting past wrongs. But I've also found that if we listen to the stories of repatriation, we learn a tremendous amount. The ancestors are still gifting us with their teachings through these stories and experiences of bringing them home. We can see through these examples the emphasis on sending knowledge into the future as seeds from which to construct new worlds. So I ask, what are the seeds that come from repatriation and reclaiming that can be gathered for us in a new world? First is the importance of braiding Indigenous knowledge, bringing together Indigenous science and knowledge frameworks with Western ways of knowing. The importance of relationality and recognition of interconnectivity. Second, I see the power of story work, of emphasizing the value of stories for carrying knowledge, and the importance of arts-based work as a powerful part of Indigenous science, as a means of sharing knowledge broadly in stories. And this is the way that human brains remember and which touch our spirit. We know this about stories. This is a deep and long-standing knowledge. And we see Western science confirming that now with all the research around stories. And third, we have the recognition that these seeds can bloom into medicines that lead to healing, and the healing that's needed to create a new, different, healthy, and sustainable future. So in reflecting on our world in crisis, we are, in Judy Dow's words, going through the narrows. We see from many Indigenous peoples around the globe efforts to repatriate and reclaim, reclaiming Indigenous bodies, land and sacred places, knowledge systems, language, and stories. It's no surprise that the furious pace we find ourselves moving along is felt as the rushing waters that precede the narrows of a river. It's at this time, as we go through the narrows, that Indigenous ways of knowing are at the forefront. Our knowledge systems and methods of teaching and learning are also being reclaimed. And these will give us seeds to take from one world to grow and nurture something new in another. I want to circle back to the Sky Woman story from the start of my talk, because I haven't yet shared the ending. And as Native people, we know that things often circle around and end back where they began, but with a new perspective. The Sky Woman story continues and explains the next step in building a new world. After Sky Woman lands with the help of the geese in the new world and then dances Turtle Island into existence, she gives birth to her baby, a daughter. They live happily on Turtle Island, and her daughter becomes pregnant with 2 sons. One son displays many good qualities. The other has many negative traits. And he actually causes a difficult birth for Sky Woman's daughter, who dies in childbirth and is buried. Importantly, for considerations of the themes of reclaiming as healing and reclaiming as a teacher, and as we think about transforming practices and new worlds, creating these beautiful new worlds, in the place where her body is put to rest, several of the most important plant medicines sprout up. Sweetgrass comes from her hair, tobacco, used to communicate with the spirit world for many, from her head, and strawberries grow from her heart. So strawberries are a valued plant medicine. In Anishinaabe-Moen, they are odamin, the heartberry, a powerful heart medicine, and also the leader of the berries, because they show the way forward to the other berries that ripen later in the season. Heartberries carry lessons of heart-centered practices, compassion, relationality, and interconnectivity, all aspects of successful collaborative work. And I've been inspired learning from all of you these past weeks and seeing how you're braiding knowledge in your repatriation work. You're bringing Indigenous science and knowledge systems together with Western ways of knowing. You're challenging and changing museums, universities, and government agencies. And I've enjoyed learning and hearing about how this is bringing healing to our communities. I'll close by reflecting briefly on Anna Singh's 2015 book. She has a book called The Mushroom at the End of the World, in which she talks about us all being currently in the ruins of post-capitalist society. She discusses mushrooms as a small, overlooked economic hope when large systems that exploit fail. As Anna Singh demonstrates, mushrooms require collaboration and remind us that everything touches and is connected with everything else. Mushrooms require care and gathering, and they can't be mass scaled. Anna Singh sees hope in mushrooms in post-capitalist ruins. I see hope in strawberries. With repatriation as our teacher and the seeds gifted to us through the heart-centered practices of repatriation and reclaiming, I believe we are nurturing a new future for Native peoples, for Indigenous peoples globally, in which we reclaim all of our relations. As the t-shirt says, everything back. For many Native nations, ancestors are the priority. And I have some proven strategies for facing reluctant institutions. I'm happy to share those in the Q&A. I've got a slide after this if you want to talk about that. But beyond ancestors, thinking forward into the future, beyond NAGPRA even, the skills and knowledge that we carry and have practiced in our repatriation work expands. It weaves and wraps its way outward, sending out runners, just like the strawberries. The tendrils move their way into colonial institutions that have harmed us all. These skills and knowledge reach far beyond repatriation with NAGPRA. As we heard in the panels yesterday, they guide our work in repatriating ancestors held outside the US and also in private collections. They can help our Indigenous relatives globally in repatriating their ancestors and cultural belongings. And here in the US, these same lessons of relationality and heart-centered practices can lead to repatriation of Black ancestors, other people of color, and even people taken from hospitals and mental institutions. Many of these ancestors sat on, or continue to be on the same museum shelves as our ancestors for decades. And there is no national database telling us how many. There needs to be. We know many are there because we see them. We see them in trays and boxes when we go to museums to bring home our ancestors. And like our relatives, they face the same indignities and profound violence and disrespect, being mined for data, with their skulls measured for pseudoscience and eugenics to try to prove European superiority. And it's not just in museums. These ancestors are in dental and medical schools and in biology departments, even in library archives around the country. None of these peoples gave their consent to be desecrated in this way. The illegal trade of human remains continues to this day. In fact, it hasn't stopped. If you read the book Red Market, you can learn more. Graves are desecrated daily in China, India, and elsewhere, then sold to US institutions for use in university courses, for teaching collections. So as we reclaim and repatriate our ancestors, institutions begin thinking about how they still are involved in this. It's still happening, not with Native ancestors, but with others, the ancestors of others. Our repatriation work teaches us how to change university policies to ensure that ancestors who are not yet repatriated are not used in teaching courses. As many of you know, many universities still use Native American remains in teaching. So even as they're working on repatriation, many of these institutions are still using ancestral remains in teaching practices with students. So we also need to remember to ask universities, not just if they have Native human remains and cultural belongings, but if our ancestors are used in teaching. And we also have to work to institute policies to ensure that they are not. These are just some of the ways our repatriation work as a teacher. And these same skills and knowledge we've developed in repatriation can help heal our planet in crisis. As we partner together to indigenize and decolonize museums, universities, government agencies, and science. It's my hope that as we come to the other side of the Narrows, we'll have created a future in which the lessons and wisdom of the Heartberry lead our way. Miigwech, thank you for listening.
Let's give those emojis for Sonya, Dr. Atalay. Thank you so much. I am rendered speechless by the beauty of your lecture, and I'm so looking forward to this discussion with folks from the audience, because I'm a little bit overwhelmed by what perfect timing your presentation is for our conference, the meaningful words and work that you're speaking at, and I couldn't think of a better way to close off and end all of our discussions and work over the last 3 weeks. So thank you so much, Sonya. I'm going to just go directly to questions. I hope everyone is okay with that. Please give us your questions in the Q&A tab, and please raise your hand if you'd like to join us. If it's too difficult to type, you have a long question, or would just prefer to speak versus type a question, raise your hand. And we're going to start with a question from Dr. Veronica Passfield. He asks, have you experienced tension with using the word story in your work? Is it adequately valued in the academy, in your opinion?
Thank you so much, Veronica, for that. I've seen things changing. I think that just like with, for example, the comic books, right? I was arguing that this work should count, right? People need to learn to work with communities and develop things from the work together that matter to communities, that communities want. So I was making arguments that these things should, quote unquote, count for what we need to produce in the academy. Why else are we doing the research? Just to produce something that, 10 people will read, maybe, where you have something that 10,000 copies have been distributed out there. And I've seen that, for example, with comics, now that's changing, that's being accepted, that storytelling is the same way. I think that that's become much more acceptable, less so in the sciences, I think much more so in the humanities, but in the sciences even, we're starting to see that. Earlier today, I'm working on a proposal for the National Science Foundation to develop a Braiding Knowledge Center where we work with science departments, to help kind of train and teach students with these skills. And in looking to what other National Science Foundation has funded, they've actually funded things around this and around Indigenous knowledge. So for me, I'm seeing it change, which is exciting, but I'm also careful because we know what these institutions do. They gobble, they extract, right? And that's what I worry, is that as we bring Indigenous ways of knowing and being into institutions, we need to do that with care to make sure that it's not just kind of consumed and gobbled up and taken as Western, that Western world has always known this. So that's kind of where I see things, that it's being more and more understood and seen as rigorous research, real science, Indigenous science, but that we have to do that with care, because I will not be part of having this consumed.
Perfect. I'm going to bring in Karen Stevens to the stage. Karen, you're coming. Feel free to share your video if you'd like. There you go.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'm sorry if I stumble over my words. Asking questions of Sonya it makes me very nervous. Sonya, I'm sorry. I'm using your braided knowledge framework in my dissertation right now, hopefully correctly. So this was a fantastic keynote. So and my question actually follows up on what you just said. So for me, I see that the language of repatriation and heart-centered work is sort of the future of archaeology. And so I was going to ask if you have any advice for non-Indigenous students and educators on how they might incorporate Indigenous pedagogy and Native science into their practice without doing that extracting, without recolonizing Indigenous knowledge.
Oh, thank you. I couldn't have planted this question like any better. It's such an important question, and thank you for asking it. I think that, again, this is what we have to think about, how we do this appropriately. And I often have students and other faculty, scientists, scholars talk to me and say, well, I want to do this. I want to use this work or these ways of thinking, but I don't want to be disrespectful. I don't want to appropriate this. What do I do? How do I do that? And I often think about this kind of connected to the connection between indigenizing and decolonizing, which I see as two different things. Where indigenizing is bringing that braiding, that weaving of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous practices into these institutions, our ways of knowing, our ways of doing. And that work of indigenizing has to be led by Indigenous peoples. And what we also know from our communities is that we credit, we acknowledge, we're always doing that, acknowledging and crediting whose knowledge it is, where it came from. So I think that making sure you're reading and quoting Indigenous scholars, but also Indigenous community members, and taking that knowledge seriously. It's not just that we quote what's in books. that we also give knowledge, give that knowledge from community members what it deserves, which is that it's equally important, and we credit and acknowledge that you look to Indigenous scholars to lead the work of indigenizing, but that we understand that this broader project of decolonization is the work of all of ours, and we all have to be involved in that. So that's kind of what I think of as where to begin, that you read and learn and listen from that you're already doing, and then begin acknowledging and pointing and citing people and where you learned this from, that you don't somehow just take it on as yours, right? But that you always remember to acknowledge those practices. I hope that helps answer your question as a start.
It does. And I kind of have a follow-up question to that. So specifically related to my research, I excavated sites that date to the Archaic period, and I am located in Kentucky, which has, has a long history of people believing that it was not a place where Indigenous people lived because of removal. So creating, well, first of all, my dissertation my research originally did not have this direction of doing all of this citing of Indigenous thought, which it does now. So I had not planned on creating a collaborative sort of environment for my research. So I'm sort of doing things on the fly. But for research where it's not as easy to, have that collaboration because of location or institutional structures that just aren't ready for that change or location. Do you have any advice on where to go from there when that building of community and collaboration is more difficult?
Another perfect question. Thank you for that. So because of students like yourself who are wanting to work with communities, who want to do partnerships, who want to do this work in a different way and create that beautiful future world that we're talking about. I found that students had these sorts of questions about doing community-based research or feeling, is it community-based enough? How do I get started? What can I do? So I worked with a group of 30 students from every kind of discipline you can imagine, from STEM fields, archaeology, anthropology, public health. And we put together a book. It's coming out in just a couple weeks. It's called The Community-Based PhD. And it's written by graduate students, for graduate students, and they share their experiences and all these sorts of challenges you're talking about. Like, how do I work with communities? How can I get started? And one of the things that I would answer to, so I would leave it to them to share their experiences, and you can see that book. University of Arizona Press is doing a great job of publishing that. But from my own experience, I would say what's really important is thinking about the whole project doesn't have to be 100% community-based. You can choose a portion of it. You can develop those relationships now. You can start thinking about how you can grow the relationships in the future. So a lot of times students think, oh, it has to be fully community-based from the very beginning, or else what I'm doing is useless and they want to give up. And I always say, start with the relationships. Think about that heart-centered work and let those relationships guide your work forward. And you'll find ways, listening to the community and their wants, what they'd like to see, you'll find ways to expand your work from there. So that's at least a starting point, starting to have conversations and developing deep listening skills. I talk about that in my chapter in that book, how essential it is and how lacking we are. We don't have any courses in graduate work about listening. And we really need to have those sorts of, that's a life skill, but that's definitely a research skill. And I think that's one of those lessons that we learn from Indigenous peoples of deep listening. So that's some of the advice I would share.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. I've got a question from Melanie O'Brien. Do you have a definition for Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous traditional knowledge, particularly as it relates to repatriation?
I'm so, I don't know why I'm so horrible with definitions, and I don't have one off the top of my head, but I think that I could point to some scholars who maybe work in that area and think about what exactly we mean by traditional knowledge. And I really just think about and try to teach students about oral history teachings, and that there's the broad umbrella of traditional knowledge and then different aspects of it. So TEK being one very specific and defined aspect. So Charles Menzies is someone who talks a lot about traditional ecological knowledge, and he's at University of British Columbia. And so he's someone who's done great work with really thinking about TEK and what that means and how we work together on that. But I don't have a specific definition. I'm sorry, Melanie.
What is your opinion on allowing the use of Indigenous methodologies in academic research that typically refuse to acknowledge its validity?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of, well, even I guess we're circling back around to how we started with what Shannon said. I'm a big fan of kicking down the door, but being able to kick down the door and do it very, calmly and speaking in ways that I think people will hear. I don't always do that at home. My husband will tell you, and with friends, close friends, I do rage and get angry and frustrated. But I do try to, I think we need to change these institutions. That's my view. I know others will say it's not worth it. Forget the academy. Let's just do this work outside. But when I think about, as I said in my talk, our planet in crisis and what the stakes are for all of us, recognizing that institutions are going to continue and are going to be doing research, and seeing the ways that there are openings. And, again, I'll say in the sciences, when I'm seeing millions of dollars being put towards Indigenous knowledge and TEK and working together with communities, I think that's a hopeful spot. And those are kind of the cracks that I see those strawberry kind of tendrils working their ways into. And kind of, we know what happens. They break stone apart. They break things apart. And I really believe that we can do that in these institutions.
Yes, I like that image. Here we go. We've got Jennifer. Your Indigenizing the Academy Indigenous pedagogy work is really interesting. Can you comment on issues or challenges you have worked through in teaching your university classes, especially with art classes and non-native students, in avoiding appropriation?
Yeah, so I teach a course. I use this in all of my courses. And if any of my students are here, they'll tell you they've made story baskets, they've done comics, they do animations. And I teach a course, for example, I actually teach a methods course called Comics, Cartoons, and Communicating Research. So it's a course I use this also I teach an Indigenous Methods and Theories course. And these are courses that students from the whole university come to, not just within my department. So I think there's a great interest in this. I think some of the challenges, not so much from the students that I see in the classes, because the students who come to these classes are clearly already interested and want to engage. They're not the ones who are saying, oh, what is this? This is crazy. Some of my colleagues are. So I do get comments from my colleagues, things like, oh yeah, you're all just sitting over there making coloring books, or whatever, not understanding what's actually being done. So I'd say that's, and I think I always bring up the word rigor, and I do that intentionally because that word has been used so much against us that our work isn't rigorous, right? And so I like to say, no, I use that word to say and show and demonstrate how rigorous this work is. So that's some of the way that I try to kind of flip that script. But yeah, definitely with colleagues within my own department, trying to get legitimacy for some of the work, which is interesting. Another kind of approach that I use is I take what the universities say in their long strategic plans. I'm a big fan. That's one of the kind of 7 strategies that I use. Take what the words in their strategic plans, because they look at that. The leaderships talk about those strategic plans all the time. So use those words and reframe whatever you have to say in using their own words, because when they say they care about something and you make them say, okay, well, you care about working with communities, you care about ethics, you care about all the things in the strategic plan. This is how what I'm doing with braiding knowledge, with arts-based research, with knowledge mobilization. This is how it connects to the strategic plan. So I kind of have learned to use their own words in that way. And then I always point to universities in Canada, because Canada talks about knowledge mobilization. They have, I feel like there's so much going on that their granting agencies understand. So.
Very good. Very good. Okay. We've got Judith Shapiro is coming to the stage. Hi, Judy.
Hi, I've mastered finding the thing. Oh, I have to take the hood off the camera. Hi.
Hi, Judy.
Hi. So I'm going to listen to this many, many times. I'm so glad this is recorded. And I'm thinking in a lot of directions, but here are some of the things that I hear. First, I want to pass on that since I've been multitasking the last 2 weeks, the White House summit with Indigenous nations this week announced a number of things, including that they're intending to utilize traditional Indigenous knowledge in their climate change matters.
Wonderful.
And I thought, that belonged in this discussion. What else did I have in mind? So a lot of what I do as a lawyer is translation. Mm-hmm. And I've been working with tribal communities long enough and been reprimanded and listened finally long enough that I know that I have to, and we talked about this, I have to use traditional knowledge in many forms, including the lady who sits with me for 5 hours and gives me these nuggets of important things. And so much of it is translation, so that when you were talking about how a sacred site is animate, what that popped in me was hearing a discussion about how the Algonquian language divides nouns into animate and inanimate, and how central that is to a worldview. And all of a sudden that clicked in place for me in a way it had not. But my job is to take this and package it in a way that it makes sense to bureaucrats and other lawyers, which is going beyond the academy to people who aren't used to stretching their minds, whose minds are used to keeping things in boxes.
Yes.
And I feel like that's something worth exploring. Like, how do you take it behind? And the strategy of saying, well, you say you care about X. I mean, that's what we do all the time as lawyers, is package things as, well, this is what you said, so this is what you're supposed to be doing. But it's very hard to take it. We can't submit a comic book, right? We can't do that. We can be in the position, and have been in the position, of saying, you want this question answered, and we can't tell you because that is information we're not permitted to share. In fact, we aren't permitted to know it as lawyers.
Yes.
Can you talk about having to do that level of taking it out of the comfort of the academy, the relative comfort of the academy,
yes.
into where people like me are sort of hired help trying to figure out how to translate it further?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, and something I struggle with too, even in the academy. Right. And the example is just kind of a funny story I'll share quickly that comes to mind is I was asked to be part of this work with SETI, right? The Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, because they wanted to bring in Native and Indigenous scholars to think about, because SETI isn't just listening now, they're talking about sending out signals. And they wanted to bring in Native and Indigenous studies scholars to think about, why may that not be a good idea? And, and I think it's interesting to think about bringing in Indigenous people to think about and advise on that. And so in that room, here we are with all these scientists who speak a language that is just completely, we could not have been, further apart, and trying to get them to understand something like, I shared with them that water or stones are animate. I shared with them, like in the language, this way of thinking about animate and inanimate. And they were like, but that's not right, because stones aren't alive, which was a kind of tricky way to then say, if you can't understand what I'm saying as a human of your own species who speaks your own language fluently as my first language about animacy, something that I'm telling you another human believes in, then how do you think you are qualified to be engaging with other beings? And it made me laugh. I still think about that. I don't know how it landed, right? I know intent and impact, right? I don't know how it landed. But we did then have a conversation about, well, what can we do together, right? So the thinking together and bringing hearts together, I was hoping would result in doing something together, which is thinking about some ethics protocols around what should happen when engaging with other beings, right? And so that's where that's leading, right? Working on, I wanted to do it as a traditional IRB. In the universities, we have IRB protocols that you have to follow. And I wanted to fill out an IRB protocol that talks about like an IRB protocol for meeting other than human life outside of the earth, and do something together in that way. So I don't know. I believe in relationships. I believe in the heart-centered work. I believe in using stories like this one to try to get across an example. And I think also that working on something together that helps you get to that next step, and like an IRB or a kind of research ethics guidelines can help move things forward. But it's very tricky, and I thank you for your work of translation. It's so critical.
That's great. Did you have any follow-up, Judy? No?
The one thing I will put in, the other thing that was resonant in as you were speaking today, is I've also been sitting in on the ongoing consultations the department is doing about boarding school. And one of the people who was present in the consultation yesterday, it was a Native person who said, I had this whole research protocol handy, and I was going to do this and do all of these interviews and start assembling information. And someone said, are you sure you know what you're getting into? Are you sure you know how telling these stories is going to be painful? And this is now the theme of a lot of the comments in this consultation. And I'm not going to go into what was said, but I've spent a lot of very painful hours just listening. Yeah. Because I feel like I should hear that there's no way to do this work without listening to the hard part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so true, that piece of listening. And again, I'll come back to say, how do you teach listening? How do you train people to do that? I don't know. I think it's an essential skill for us to move forward and to move beyond the narrows.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could go on and talk about that more with relationships with museums and institutions, right? They do not want to get into those conversations because oftentimes they feel like they are being blamed, right? So they feel like we are pointing fingers at them, when what oftentimes we just need to be heard and listened to so that it's understood why this is difficult, why it's painful. It's those are really difficult stories to listen to, but it's necessary. And what is so magical about being able to sit and listen to those stories is that healing occurs for all parties.
Yeah.
Right? Once you get past that, there's another wonderful space that you can sit together in, and that many institutions won't take the risk or the time to get there with us. Right? Here we have, I think we have one more question I'm seeing, and this is more of a comment, but have you applied to the Creative Capital Award? It could support components of your research that use art practices. I've served as one of the few Indigenous judges and field experts there for the last couple of years. Happy to answer questions. That's Irene Villasenor, and we can always put you in contact with her, Sonya.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. No, I haven't. I hadn't heard of it, but I appreciate that. And I will reach out and be in touch. I would love to be connected and think about other ways of doing this sort of work, raising funds. And I think raising the funds is important to be able to do the work, but it's also important because, again, more of these kind of runners that spread out into these spaces. When you have a center supported, for example, hopefully by the National Science Foundation, called the Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledge, right? The more these things are visible, the more people see it, it just becomes, the air we breathe. That's what I hope we see, these transformations that can happen. So thank you for that resource.
I would love, Sonya, we're out of questions. I would love if you have any ending words, or if you wanted to share that one slide you were talking about, some strategies.
Oh, sure.
Feel free to do so.
Yeah, let me show that. Let me get back into my... Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so here we go. And these are just from last year. Shannon Martin and I and David Michener, we put together a session for this. And in thinking about that, I kind of came up with some strategies from my experience with being in a university, trying to force universities to make these changes. So here are the kind of things that I kind of have used and find very useful. Number one, building coalitions within the institution and with people in the institution who I found, for example, people who study ethics and who study like history of science have been some really great allies. They're outside of, for example, anthropology departments who tend to want to hold on to remains. So having people from outside and from different places in the university, involving students in the work. I have that as number two, visible protests, but particularly students. I find universities, it sounds kind of weird in the beginning, but they're terrified of students. They're afraid students are going to tweet and start a movement and, badmouth the institution. It's almost like, bad reviews on, whatever your Yelp. They don't want bad Yelp reviews from students. So getting students aware and raising awareness, students always tend to be looking for a movement. So they have power in ways you wouldn't expect. Number three, making direct appeals to university leadership, such as regents. That's what happened at the University of Michigan. Those kind of direct appeals, rather than just like talking to people in the museum or the university, if you're not getting anywhere. What we found at the University of Michigan, and it was the same thing here at UMass, the leadership had no idea that this stuff was going on. They had no clue. And when they found out, and when you frame it in such a way as to completely mortify them as like, what, our university is doing this? You can really have some inroads. And especially, again, when you have those kind of coalitions and the students who are knowledgeable, they can't just be out there, waving signs. They have to be knowledgeable, but that can be helpful. Number four is kind of also, they're all related, but moving the decision-making out of anthropology departments and into, for example, at UMass, we moved the decision-making into the campus legal compliance. There's a head lawyer for the campus. And when we go to campus legal compliance and we frame it as, are you aware of NAGPRA law? Oh, no, you're not? Wow, that's interesting. You need to learn about this and you're out of compliance, right? And working at that kind of a level, getting into, for example, like being heard by the chancellor's office or being heard by research and engagement offices. I know that that's where things sit at UC Berkeley. And it's really important to have those spaces, which is outside of a single department making decisions. Again, that's what worked at Michigan. Number 5, campus-wide committee, creating these committees. If you're on the university side, this is something really important that you can do. That it's not just faculty, for example, who are making these sorts of decisions, that you have people from different parts of the university. People from student life should be sitting on those committees. And of course, you should have Native Nations represented, right, from the region where you're at. And more than one person, so that there's not just one Native person who's there who has to be the spokesperson and is, left alone. Those kind of campus-wide committees that have real power in terms of policies and making decisions, I think those work because you're creating relationships there. That relationality can really happen well in those kind of campus committees. So that's a good way to kind of move things forward. Building relationality into policies, like I said, the indigenizing, thinking about what policies could look like. I always say, go to the University of Michigan, look at their policies, look at what they've done. They've changed, as I said, tremendously, and think about what policies might look like. And always use the word, oh, there it is, in number 7, peer institutions. I find that being on the inside of a university, this is something I already said, connect to strategic plans, but they constantly make comparison to what are our peer institutions doing? It's interesting who they think are their peers, right? Like, does everyone think Harvard is their peer? I don't know. They often do, but make comparisons to the peer institutions. So we could say, oh, look, Michigan's doing this. Berkeley's doing this. Look what happened at Penn. Do you want that to happen here? Right? Using peer institutions is a really great strategy. So that's just some of what I learned. And I don't know, those have been helpful. So maybe they're helpful for others.
Those are super helpful. And I really love that slide. Thank you so much, Sonya. Anything else you want to say in closing?
No, but just miigwech to everyone for taking time to listen and for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much. Everyone, give her some love, some hand claps and some hearts. There we go. Thank you, everyone. Please don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. We have a special guest with us. Sonya, we're going to transition into our closing. I hope that you'll stay with us, but you're welcome to mute or mute your video if you'd like. Cecil, we are going to bring you on. We have a special guest, Mr. Cecil Pavlat from Sault Ste. Marie, who is going to give us a closing out of the conference and ending. So as Cecil comes to the camera, let me say to everyone, thank you so much, Yakoki, for participating in our conference over the last 3 weeks. This has been incredible. The speakers and you, the participants, have been so incredible and supportive of this work. And I hope that it's been helpful to you. You will likely get information from us, perhaps a survey by email that we'd love for you to fill out so that you can express yourself and what was productive for you in this conference, what you'd like to see more of or less of, maybe less of me, more of Colleen. And what else we can do to support you in your efforts to decolonize your institutions and indigenize the repatriation and relationship process. So, Cecil, are you there?
Anine, I am here.
Ah, yeah.
There we go.
Cecil, it's all yours.
How? Anine, Minoa, Kinagoya, Cecil Pavlot, Indigenous Gigdangwasa, Nin, Ojibwe, Minoa, Jagana, Shiandao, Ji Jokando Dem, Bao Ting and Donjiba. Seman Dapanan, Ginadamoyek, Kinagoya, Ginama, Namada, Agajamnado, Amigwich Kinagago, Gimijang. Minoa, Ingading, Gigishgut, Kizis Kibanabit. Chimigwich Kimijang, Awisa Bamad Zawin. Wadokushnang, Jinamayang, Goak Chibamosayang. Wabanang, Jawanang, and Gabinang, Minagi Wade Nang, Mshom Suk, Nokmusuk, Kinoa, Nem Debiat. Not emotional. Joy Mishnang, Kinagoya, Mompi, Nongo Gishgut. Skok Makoy, Amigwich Kinagago, Gimijang, Waisiok, Banashiak, Gigoek, Minadon Sansuk, Chitwa Mishkike, Nibishmina, Nesa Win. So once again, Miigwech, for that same to speak to Creator in spirit on behalf of all of us. And that prayer, we're always taught to give thanks before we ask for anything. And so when we say not emotional, jouer missional, we're saying help us all. Take pity on us, the two-legged. And when we do that, we acknowledge that humility and know and understand that we need help, not only from each other, but from that spirit world. And we ask them to bring that direction, that guidance that each of us may need. And sometimes all we need to say is that simple word, not emotional. It means help us all, but Spirit knows the help that each of us may need. And so it applies differently to every one of us because all of our needs are different. And so we pray in that way, acknowledging Creator and Spirit. And this song that I'm going to sing to close out this awesome conference, this getting together of people with like mind and some without like mind, which is okay. So we tell our stories, and they choose to believe them, so be it. If not, so be it. So these things that we do, all of us, so important. We talk about healing, and I've been taught and told that until every ancestor is brought home and healed, and reburied, we will not be healed. And I believe that. And so again, I know myself kind of at the end of my days in repatriation, and that those young ones that are going to pick this up, I have that confidence that they will do what is needed to be done in terms of sticking with this obligation, this responsibility that our ancestors have left us. And so now, because their voice is silent, we are their voice, and we will speak truth, and we'll speak in a kind and generous way until the day comes when maybe we need to change that strategy a little bit. So this song, I know I was asked for a traveling song, but this song is kind of that, but it's more. At the beginning there, we sang that Spirit calling song. And so we called upon Spirit to come and help, to bring that guidance again, and to understand as two-legged, as Anishinaabe, that we need all the help that we can get to live a good life to follow that good red road. And so this song is to kind of release them, because when we ask them to come, we also need to let them know when they can go back to that spirit world. And so this song is for that purpose, but as well, when we sing this song, we sing it at Anjakit Gitchitwawin, Changing Worlds ceremonies. And it was composed here in my community by a couple of young men. Sorry about that. And so it's also used for those ones that have just passed, to thank them and to kind of send them along their way too. So I will sing this song. Now, miigwech, that song is thanking our warriors and here and as well in that spirit world. And so miigwech misau.
Thank you, Cecil, and thank you, everyone. And with that, please, wonderful evening. Be safe. Please take care.
Everything back.